Speaking personally, the Earl Russell. What follows is a selection made from Lord Russell's part in talks between himself and John Chandos, which took place on the 11th and 12th of April 1961 at his house in North Wales. John Chandos speaks first.
Lord Russell spoke of how the movement for unilateral disarmament began.
A broadcast I did in Christmas 1954 or 53, I forget which I called Man's Peril. And that started the movement everywhere. That was the beginning. Immediately after that, I got a collection of scientists of both East and West to sign a joint document, which was the last act of Einstein's life to sign it. I was traveling from Rome to Paris by air, and the pilot came in and announced to the passengers that Einstein was dead. And when I got to Paris, I found Einstein's letter agreeing to sign. And that started a whole movement among scientists, which has gone on and been very strong. It's stronger in America than it is here, a great deal. The American scientists are much better than ours. Well, I mean, there are a much larger percentage of them who are willing to sign things and so on, expressing our sort of policy. I find it difficult not to get a little fanatical because the issue is so large. It's the largest that's been since Noah.
And we have no ark.
No, we have no ark, no. I had thought of bringing a bill into the House of Lords that we should at all times, while nuclear things are so unsettled, have a ship in the Antarctic with at least one woman on board of childbearing age, and of course a clergyman of the Church of England to marry her to whoever she wished to marry. You see, there's quite a chance that the Antarctic will be more or less free from fallout. And if you had a population in the Antarctic, it might start again. But I couldn't quite see their lordships accepting the bill.
In England, Bertrand Russell's opinions and personality had proved inflammable. In America, they turned out to be explosive.
I had one bad experience in America, but I've had a great many good experiences in America. I've lectured in a very great many American universities, and in some of them I've had very, very good pupils and had a really very good time indeed. I had just one bad experience in the College of the City of New York, where it was decided that I was an immoral influence and that I must not be allowed a position in such an institution. I'd written a book called Marriage and Morals, in which I advocated a certain very moderate degree of freedom, such as I think most civilized people would agree to. But there were a great many forces in New York that were not very civilized. They didn't like it. Well, it started with Bishop Manning denouncing me. And then the Catholic Church took it up. And professors and such defended me, but they didn't count. They got a woman who was a Roman Catholic and whose daughter had been going to go to the College of the City of New York to bring suit against the City of New York on the ground that her daughter would be exposed to immoral influences if I were allowed to teach there. And the City of New York was quite different from the college. The college had wanted me, but the city as such did not. And it was the city that had to defend this case, and it defended it with a view to losing it. And so it did lose it. I was teaching philosophy, but it was thought. They didn't know what philosophy was, and they thought anything I don't know must be bad. And probably philosophy teaches this sort of scandalous conduct. So it wouldn't do. As a matter of fact, I wasn't even going to teach philosophy. I was going to teach mathematical logic. But they couldn't bother with that.
In the indictment was an epithet, cherished today in recollection by Lord Russell, which was introduced by a lawyer with more zeal than literacy.
Nude, lecherous, lascivious, obscene, and aphrodisiac. I had lots of fun. I was lecturing at Los Angeles, the University of California, and I began one of my lectures. I was lecturing on history of philosophy, and I'd been talking about Plato, and I got up very solemnly and said, I owe my class an apology. I have recommended to you, not unfavourably, an author who, I regret to say, was lewd, lecherous, lascivious, and obscene. I mean Plato. Because the things that Plato says about marriage and so forth are quite as bad as anything I've ever said. I said that one shouldn't be too hard on adultery, that I thought a husband or a wife in an otherwise happy marriage ought to be able to forgive an occasional infidelity. I said also that I thought some premarital experience was desirable. It's a very interesting thing that all expert moralists, let's say all the people who really take a lot of fuss about morals, are quite obsessed by sex. I got a letter from an Anglican bishop, now dead, saying that every word in all my books was inspired by sexual lust. And he didn't know that I'd written on other subjects than sex, because sex was the only thing that interested him.
He was intransigently unwilling to admit that there was any connection between Christ and organized Christianity, especially Catholicism.
Well, they hadn't much to do with Christ. Now, Christ made two pronouncements on divorce, one of them pleasant and the other unpleasant, so the Church chose the unpleasant ones and ignored the other. In one pronouncement he says that there must be no divorce, in another he says there must be no divorce except for adultery. But the one where he says there should be none except for adultery is completely ignored by the Church. They just pretend it isn't there, because it doesn't cause so much pain. I don't object to tradition as such, I object to the Catholic tradition.
It was the Catholics who gave you so much trouble in America, wasn't it?
Yeah, but I objected to them long before that. No, I object to their attitude about birth control, their attitude about divorce, their attitude about sex generally, which comes out of St. Paul. It's all in St. Paul. And which I think is just morbid and causes a great deal of unhappiness, quite unnecessary unhappiness, both in those who obey the code and in those who don't. There are two different reasons for being furious with a man who suggests any relaxation of sexual discipline. One is that you want to show that you have no need of any such relaxation. You've never sinned. Oh no, you're entirely guiltless. And the less guiltless you are, the more strongly you will feel that. That's one contingent. And the other contingent is that which is actuated by envy, and thinks, well, I've always been virtuous, but what a pity, and how I do envy these fellows who are not. Oh, yes, there's a great change in regard to permanent relationships. There's altogether much less horror at the idea of a man and woman living openly together without being married. People will tolerate it much better than they used to. It was, of course, in one case pulled off successfully, and that was by George Eliot. But it was only because she was such a very distinguished writer that people put up with it. Otherwise they wouldn't have. No, I think it's an enormous change for the better, quite enormous. I mean, take my own case. I've had 4 wives and 3 divorces. And in the Victorian time, that would have put me rather out of the running. But nowadays, although some people raise their eyebrows a bit, it doesn't much matter. I very much prefer the present relation of the sexes. I mean, I'm thinking now not of sex particularly, but of social intercourse. I mean, you can talk to a woman much as you would to a man. Whereas when I was young, you had a whole different vocabulary for talking to women. And it was a totally different thing. You didn't dream of saying a word of truth to a woman. It would be gross and impertinent and horrible. And you just lied blankly. And it was essential to good manners that you should. And in all those ways, I mean, the relations of men and women are infinitely better than they were when I was young. And all in directions which I desired from the time when I was young. I married when I was 22, and my first wife was a Quaker. She was still a believing Quaker when I married her, but it dropped off after 3 months. And but I mean, I taught her to use gross words, and she quite accepted it. I mean, I had all the sort of views about that sort of thing that nowadays would be commonplace, but I already had them then. And I got her to adopt them all, and we lived quite happily. When I was young, most respectable married couples never saw each other naked. And I thought this was dreadful. We saw each other naked whenever we wanted to. And I had a very, very powerful impulse to sexual freedom from the moment of puberty. I remember when I first grasped the facts of sex and marriage and so forth, I thought at once, oh, of course marriage is just a superstition. There ought to be free love. It seemed to me obvious then. It didn't seem quite so obvious after a bit. And in those ways, the world is much, much nicer than it was. Much. People accept it now that you may have a casual affair with a woman with no deep feeling involved on either side. Whereas in those days, if you went outside marriage, it could only be for the most intense and profound and lifelong passion. Nothing else would excuse it.
Although there must have been a lot of secret promiscuity.
Oh, there was a great deal of that, yes. But then I didn't like hypocrisy, you see, so I couldn't accept that as a solution. Because I always hated hypocrisy. And I was thought to be a very immoral man, but only because I didn't attempt to conceal my lapses. There's nothing. In other respects, I didn't differ from anybody else. But I hated hypocrisy. I thought it beastly.
Challenging hypocrisy for the leadership of Lord Russell's personal distastes was cruelty, most of all when cruelty was used to support what seemed to him vanity or irrational superstition.
I found D.H. Lawrence perfectly intolerable. He was a fascist. Fascism hadn't yet been invented, but his wife was German, and he got it from her. It was already brooding in Germany. And he got a whole complete fascist outlook. There was to be an elite that was to have sole political power and was to compel this and compel that, and altogether there was to be no sort of freedom anywhere. And of course he always imagined himself the dictator in this system. I mean, he would always say, you must do this, you must do that. And then he would say that one mustn't compromise with the evil forces. one must proclaim one's independence and so forth and so on. So I said, well, how are you going to do it? You're going to make the speech in Trafalgar Square? Oh, no, I won't make a speech in Trafalgar Square. You'll only be talking to the vulgar. And so I said, well, are you going to do some books? Oh, no, I won't do any book. Stupid people read books. So I said, well, what are you going to do? And then he changed the subject. And he was just going to enjoy a soliloquy. I didn't like the man. I didn't like him at all. And still less did I like his wife.
I thought he was very proud of being one of the proletariat.
Well, he pretended to be, yes. He had a profound contempt for the great mass of mankind. Absolutely profound. And I didn't like it. I think Sons and Lovers is a good book. I think it's his best book, at any rate of those I've read. I thought the others were all wish fulfillment. There's one called Kangaroo, where he goes out to Australia, and at first he thinks Australia awfully dull, and then he finds they've all got plots to murder each other, and then he thinks it's a lovely country. He was a bloodthirsty fellow. He couldn't believe at all in friendship. Friendship was the thing he didn't understand.
But surely in Sons and Lovers there's supposed to be a great friendship between two people, isn't there?
Yes. But I can't remember now whether it's homosexual, but I should think it would be. He had immense force. I mean, one felt this is a man who counts.
And Shaw.
What do you say?
Shaw.
Yes?
Always seemed to be rather inhuman by his writing, as though he wasn't a man at all, as though he didn't feel the things most men felt, except vanity.
He felt vanity, and that was the whole of him. There was nothing more. I knew a lady who was secretary of the Labour Party in the University of London, and she got gradually more and more towards communism, and at last became a communist, and married a Russian and went to live out there. And in Stalin's purge, this Russian was taken away, and she never heard from him again, or heard of him, or didn't know what happened to him at all. And she was absolutely devoted to the man. And she came to England to see if anybody could do anything to influence Stalin. And she came to me among other people. And I said, well, Shaw is persona grata in Russia. Perhaps he'll do something. And so we approached Shaw about it. And he wrote her a letter, which I saw, saying, my dear lady, you have no idea how comfortable Russian penal settlements are. I'm quite sure your husband is much happier there than he would be being nagged by you. I never spoke to the man again. I thought it one of the most horrible things I'd ever known done, because the poor lady was utterly heartbroken. He was a very cruel man, very cruel, if his vanity was hurt. And his vanity was hurt in this, because it threatened his judgment of the Soviet Union. Do you see what I mean? It's not obvious that his vanity was involved, but it was. Because it was a suggestion that perhaps he was wrong in praising the Soviet Union. And that would be a suggestion that he wasn't as wise as he thought. And therefore the lady must be punished. By means of wit, he concealed the fact that he was silly. Wit is a wonderful thing for concealing. I mean, all his views about medicine, for instance, are totally silly. I met Lenin in 1920 when I was in Russia. I had an hour's talk tête-à-tête with him. And he spoke English much better than you would have expected. The whole conversation was in English. I expected it to have been in German, but I found that his English was quite good. I was less impressed by Lenin than I expected to be. He was, of course, a great man. He seemed to me a reincarnation of Cromwell, with exactly the same limitations that Cromwell had. Absolute orthodoxy. He thought a proposition could be proved by quoting a text in Marx. And he was quite incapable of supposing that there could be anything in Marx that wasn't right. And that struck me as rather limited. I disliked one other thing about him, which was his great readiness to stir up hatred. I put certain questions to him to see what his answer would be, and one of them was, you profess to be establishing socialism, but as far as the countryside is concerned, you seem to me to be establishing peasant proprietorship, which is a very different thing from agricultural socialism. And he said, oh, dear me, no, we're not establishing peasant proprietorship. He said, you see, there are poor peasants and rich peasants, and we stirred up the poor peasants against the rich peasants, and they soon hanged them to the nearest tree. Ha, 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 ha. I didn't much like that.
But he was equally vigorous in affection and admiration for those he loved.
Einstein, whom I knew fairly well, was a quite unbelievably lovable man. He was extremely simple, absolutely devoid of the slightest pretension. You might have met him in a railway train and not known that he was distinguished at all. And he was very, very friendly, very open-minded. I thought him altogether quite delightful. I think the most satisfactory great man that I've ever known. I couldn't have wished him different in any way. I loved Conrad. I thought he was a wonderful man. I didn't, of course, agree with most of his opinions, but I liked his feeling of life and its dangers. He thought of life as walking on a thin crust over molten lava, and at any moment one might sink in, and one must have discipline, one must be careful, or else one would sink right down into this dreadful thing which was there underneath. And I think in all his books you get that feeling. The sort of feeling that the best of men is on the very brink of becoming quite dreadfully bad. I mean, it's a stroke of luck if you don't. I admired him for his sort of iron rectitude, combined with such intense passion, because intense passion makes it difficult to keep rectitude. But one felt he always would.
I invited Lord Russell to evaluate the liberal Whig traditions of which he was himself a product.
I think the Whig families did something valuable in their day, but it's not something that can be done in the present world at all. And, I mean, you may regret it. I think Holland House was very delightful. At the same time, Lord Melbourne, who was one of the adornments of Holland House, got his income by torturing little children in coal mines. And desirable. And I think this sort of flower emerging from the dung was not worth preserving.
But the dung was there anyway, and the flower could be rescued from the dung, and not all Whig nobility thrived on the torturing of little children. I think of Shaftesbury, and I think of your own grandfather. What did you say about the traditions in which men voluntarily changed a society for the benefit of those oppressed, when they themselves were not going to benefit directly from these changes?
I think that there were very good men who did very good work in abolishing themselves, and I don't think they could have been so good if they hadn't been the product of a bad system. If you want to take my own case, now I, as a young man, was completely financially independent because Henry VIII liked my ancestor, and that was where my money came from. Well, Henry VIII was an old scoundrel, of course, and I can't recommend him as a person to imitate, but he left me free to pursue mathematical logic without any financial angle to it. What sort of conditions cause a nation to produce great men? Now, I've always maintained that Shakespeare would never have written his stuff if it hadn't been for our defeating the Armada. I believe that the sort of sense of successful energy that we got from that was essential to the greatness of the Elizabethan age. That's very disputable, it's only a hypothesis. I don't think it's very easy to say, but it seems to me, looking over history, that countries which have been politically powerful and then cease to be do lose culturally. People who might be culturally great cease to have the self-confidence that is necessary. Because to do anything great, you have to have enormous self-confidence. Well, I'll do this whatever people say, because everybody will say you're wrong. A man who thinks originally has at all times, I think in every country and in all ages, been exposed to persecution. Buffon, who contributed enormously to zoology and geology, was compelled by the Sorbonne solemnly to withdraw the opinion that some of the mountains that now exist did not exist when the world was older. And Vesalius, who first dissected bodies for medical reasons, was sentenced to go on a pilgrimage to the Holy Land and lost his life through shipwreck on the way home. And Galileo, we know, was condemned by the Inquisition. And in general, you may say that great innovators, for the most part, have suffered. Einstein, of course, had to leave Germany. And it's the fate of them, but they think it worthwhile. I think that liberty, in many of its forms, is almost bound to be less than it was in the 19th century or in the later parts of the 18th. You cannot do your work as an individual unless you happen to be something like a poet or well, it's no good being a composer because then you'd have to get people to perform your music. But a poet can be an individual still, but most people can't. I think the effect of the growth of authoritarianism will be extremely unfortunate. I think that it will spread to other countries. I think America, in all that we don't like, is the pattern of the future for us. It's what we shall be. And I think that the arts generally, and especially literature, will suffer very, very much. But there will always be some rebels, some who manage to produce immortal work before they're put to death. And that's what we've got to hope for.
I had suggested that there might be a reconciliation between genius and tranquility.
I don't think there is a reconciliation. I think of the ancient world. After Augustus, when the evils of turmoil and civil war had been put an end to, genius also was put an end to. With luck we shall get an Augustan age, or a post-Augustan age, an Antonine age. That's the best we can hope. But I don't think we can hope that Europe, at any rate, will produce great men. I think perhaps the Negroes will, because I think they'll be very recalcitrant to discipline. And you might quite easily get geniuses among the Negroes, but I don't think you'll get it in the white countries, because we've proved ourselves too anarchic. Our anarchism is destructive. You see, a certain amount of anarchism is necessary to genius, but not so much that the genius can't live.
The subject of the present relations between youth and their elders returned Lord Russell to his central anxiety.
Young people who've grown up under this shadow of imminent death imposed upon them by their elders, they get a sort of bitterness which you can't wonder at. And it tends, of course, to be an anarchic bitterness that isn't very fruitful. And only things like our movement keep it from being anarchic.
Perhaps the juvenile people feel the need to react against some sort of stability, against their parents' values, and they feel today that they can't abandon values because their fathers don't seem to have any.
I don't know about juvenile delinquency quite. I mean, I don't profess to understand why there is so much. But I think it has to do with unsettlement, with the fact that all the official moralists are preaching things that are atrocious crimes. And that tends to cynicism in the young.
What kind of crimes?
Extermination of the human race.
They're not actually preaching it. They don't.
They do. Well, I mean, you'll find any number of people, especially in America, who will say better we should all be dead than that we should submit to the communists. Any number. I had a long, long controversy in print on that very point. And Mrs. Roosevelt, in my presence, said that she thought it would be better.
But that's hardly preaching extermination.
Well, yes, but I mean, it is so bad that when the young hear that their elders want them exterminated, or at least are prepared to advocate policies that must end in that, it tends to make the young rather cynical.
Talking of youth and the future led me to ask Lord Russell to consider the real source of the vehement feelings of antagonism between the Soviet Union of Russia and the United States of America.
The thing that separates America and Russia is said on both sides to be a difference of ideology. And I dare say they believe that, but it's not in fact the truth. I think it's a contest of power. Such a contest of power as has happened over and over again in history. It happened, of course, in the time of the Emperor Charles V, between Austria and Spain on the one side, and France on the other. It's happened over and over again, a contest for supreme power. It's never succeeded, but the world has survived it in the past because there were no nuclear weapons. But we cannot now survive such a contest, and we must learn to tolerate each other. And I think that's a very difficult thing to teach people. I think it's not so difficult in England as it is in America, but in America it's extremely difficult to teach any kind of toleration of Russia. Wherever you get a large political fear, it produces intolerance. Now, the aristocrats of the 18th century in England were on the whole a very tolerant lot. Then came the French Revolution, and they all thought, oh, tolerance leads to the guillotine, we'll drop it. And they all became bigots. And the same thing has happened with the Russian Revolution. It frightened all these men, and so they've all turned into bigots. And I think that's quite natural, but the bigotry is only political. It doesn't apply in other spheres. And the only cure for the bigotry is to have the danger diminished. You must remember what happened to Priestley during the French Revolution, when the mob in Birmingham sacked his laboratory and made him feel so unsafe that he had to go to America. Priestley was attacked by the mob on the ground that he was a friend of France and a sort of fellow traveller, and he was thought to be responsible for the cutting off of the king's head and all that sort of thing. And so the mob sacked his laboratory, with the result that it was Lavoisier who discovered oxygen, but who equally lost his head. He was executed by the revolutionaries, who said that the Republic had no need of chemists. People like us who live in a more or less enlightened environment simply don't know what are the great public forces underneath. that may at any moment overwhelm us. But there it is. I mean, it's just what happened to Socrates. Socrates went on for 70 years quite happily, and then one day they thought, no, we'll put this man to death, and they did. An upsurge of the uneducated. You see, there are two different streams. There are the people who have a status and an income that depends upon public superstition. They lead the thing. And then there is the public superstition itself, which is capable of being aroused, because it thinks that this sort of thing is wicked.
What do they put first in America?
What in fact they put first, though not in words, is American power. They've taken over from us the imperialist mentality, which we've had to give up, because we thought it was more fun killing Germans than having an empire. Now, Nelson taught his midshipmen 3 precepts. You must speak the truth, you must shoot straight, and you must hate a Frenchman as you would the devil. And that was because France and England were contesting for world hegemony. And as long as people think that that's a possibility, you will get this hatred. And what you've got to persuade the governments of both Russia and America is that owing to the existence of nuclear weapons, the wars which would be necessary to give you world hegemony will instead give you nothing but corpses. And it's no good doing that, it won't work. But I do find, not only in America, but I find in England, in France, in Germany, I find an almost complete psychological block to understanding things, to understanding what the present state of the world is. Now, I found today in the Daily Mail a speech that Macmillan made in Canada, saying you needn't mind unilateralist feeling in England. He said, if ever the call comes, the young will go straight from the ranks of the neutralists into the ranks of Her Majesty's forces, as they have so often done in the past. Now that shows that Macmillan, in common with other people in governments, hasn't understood what modern war would be. You know, of course, that if war between Russia and the West breaks out, we shall have 4 minutes warning. During those 4 minutes, there will be consultations between London and Washington. They're to come to an agreement which they will submit to the other allies of NATO, and in the end, long after they're all dead, they may decide what they ought to have done if they'd been alive. And Macmillan doesn't realize that it won't be the slightest use for these young men to think, oh, well, we ought to have fought, because just as they're thinking it, they'll be dead. They're only going to have 4 minutes to think about it. You wouldn't believe the number of letters I get from America saying, I quite agree with all you say, but I don't know a single other person who does. If you live in a rather small town, small country town, you won't find one person to agree with you. Not one. I have found that the unilateralist policy, as I understand it, is not what its opponents think it is. I conceive it as only a policy for Britain and perhaps for the other allies of the United States, but not for the United States itself. I should like to try to explain why I think that. To confine oneself to Britain, it has been made perfectly clear, both by American arms experts and by Khrushchev and Malinowski, that if we allow the Americans to use our soil for purposes which the Russians consider unfriendly, they may attack us, Britain, and wipe us out, which would take them perhaps half an hour, without bringing on a war with the United States. And their motive for doing that, if they did it, would be that we allow the American forces to use our territory. I think there's no reason whatever to suppose that if we were neutral, the Russians would wantonly attack us. They haven't done so with any of the neutral powers, and I don't think they would. I think that as long as there are nuclear weapons in the world, no country in the world is safe. We are all exposed to obliteration within half an hour or at most an hour. But there are degrees of risk, and undoubtedly the allies of America run a greater risk than neutrals do. And that's one reason why I should like to see Britain not in NATO and not allowing its territory to be used by Americans. It's only one of the reasons. There are others. And I think that Britain can do a great deal more for the cause of nuclear disarmament and for the cause of world peace as a neutral and perhaps a leader of other neutrals in drawing up possible compromise schemes giving no net advantage to either East or West, than can be done by our present policy. I don't hope for important goods from government. I think to that extent I agree with the anarchists. I think government is necessary, quite necessary, but it can only prevent evils and can't promote goods. If we pull through, I don't know whether we shall, but if we pull through, I think the world will be a better one than it ever has been before, because scientific technique is capable of conferring quite enormous benefits.
I asked Lord Russell to classify his career and his main work.
Oh, I don't know. How should I describe myself? I think it's very difficult to describe oneself, because after all it's a subject on which one's not quite impartial. But my principal work has been in logic. And logic, I think, is not really part of philosophy, it's part of mathematics. And as part of mathematics, I think it should continue and prosper. But as part of philosophy, no.
Do you not find that logic applied to empirical affairs in human life produces rather unpopular conclusions?
Well, I think any intelligent thinking does. It doesn't matter whether it's logic or something else. But, the populace in general doesn't like intelligence because it's apt to go against their prejudices.
And of all prejudices and superstitions, the worst, the most insidious and malevolent, have always been, for Bertrand Russell, those arising from religious dogma. We had been talking of the role and influence of the Church, and I had been arguing that oppressive churchmen from popes downwards, engaged on worldly or short-sighted ambitions, were simply fallible men, and not necessarily discreditors of Christianity.
An awful time. Reforming abbots sent to a monastery would be murdered by the other monks. It happened over and over again. It was a frightful business, reforming the church.
Well, the Church was merely an expression of the times and place. And without something, however imperfect, whatever little learning had survived, would have just been obliterated in the 7th and 8th centuries.
Oh, the Church served a purpose, and that is served a purpose. And, of course, the Church didn't mean to serve that purpose. Gregory the Great, you remember, wrote a furious letter to a bishop because he heard the bishop was teaching grammar. And he said, you mustn't teach grammar. It is impossible for the praise of Christ and Jupiter to exist in the same mouth. He said, a report has reached us which we cannot mention without a blush, that thou expoundest grammar to certain friends. And that was Gregory the Great. You see, the whole attitude of the Christian towards God is based upon Oriental tyrannies, monarchies. It's the attitude one took towards the king, and it's an attitude which a modern man should consider abject and contemptible.
It seems to me that there may be many people in the world who require some kind of protective reassurance between them and the worst extremities of reality, and who are simply not capable of facing reality if it is as terrible as the removal of these assurances may make it appear to them, and that they are going to create their own superstitions if you don't give them some kind of protective superstition.
I don't think that's true, because I think the Church at present is a very, very grave danger. The Church opposes birth control, and only by the worldwide adoption of birth control is there any chance for the human race.
You have managed to live without religion. Do you feel that you've missed anything very important through that? Do you feel that would have been a great sacrifice, that walking without the prop of religion?
I don't feel I've missed anything through not believing in religion. I think, on the contrary, that the religious people have missed a very great deal indeed. They've missed the kind of pride that stands upright and looks at the world and say, well, you can kill me, but anyway, here I am, I stand firm. And they've missed that, and I think that's a very, very valuable thing that a person should have. And I shouldn't like at all to go through life in a sort of creepy crawly way, full of terror and being bolstered up all the time, as if I were a fainting lady being kept from sprawling on the ground. Because no human being whom I can respect needs the consolation of things that are untrue. He can face the truth and live with it.
That was the voice of Bertrand Russell. This record consists of extracts from the complete recording, speaking personally, made by Lord Russell at his house in North Wales and issued on 2 records in the None Such record series.